Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good day. Welcome to the CES Letters podcast. My name's Easton. I am your host today, and I'm joined with our good friend and brother, Stephen C. Harper. Steve, how are you?
I'm great. How are you, sir?
I'm good. Everybody knows you. We have so many episodes with you, but just the brief introduction. You are one of the, you're kind of head over Wilford Woodruff papers, right?
No, I am the executive editor.
Which sounds pretty important.
Yeah, that's why I wanted that title.
Of course.
It sort of means the boss of the people who do the work on the editing part.
Okay.
And Jennifer Mackley is the executive director.
Which sounds also very important.
Yeah, she is the visionary and the workhorse who brought the Wilford Woodruff papers to bear. And she's the one who really is the brains behind the operation and the blood, sweat, and tears. Beside that, there's a terrific board of directors presided over by Jordan Clements, a direct descendant of Wilford Woodruff, as well as an accomplished church leader and professional in a lot of areas, and a whole bunch of really, really talented and supportive people, and then donors who just have made it possible. It's really been, I think, miraculous to see how much it's advanced in a relatively short time.
It's an amazing project.
I think so.
There's a lot to it. I love it. And I think we should talk a little bit more about that here as we start the interview.
Okay.
But so you're executive editor of the Wilford Woodruff papers. Mm-hmm. You're an editor on the Joseph Smith papers.
Not anymore.
You were, though.
For 10 years, I was a volume editor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was
really
on
cool.
That was on one of the facsimiles, or
no?
Revelations, and what was it?
Yeah, I worked on a couple of volumes in the document series, and I worked on a volume in the Revelations and Translation series.
Very cool. And then you were one of the historians over the Saints, volume 1, right?
Well, I worked on that project formally for 6 years. I was the managing historian of the project and one of a few general editors. Jed Woodworth is doing that job now. Right. And I ended that when volume 1 came out, and he has overseen 2, 3, and 4.
That's awesome. So you've written a number of excellent books.
And a few crappy ones.
I don't know about that. I will not give you that much, Steve, but you're a very smart guy. You're an academic. You're very intelligent. Are you okay if we call you an academic? I know that
sure.
Can be a divisive term sometimes, but you're very smart. And so I think what we talk about today, it'll be interesting hearing from somebody kind of your stature. And so today we're going to be talking about anti-intellectualism as found in the CES letter.
Okay. And
so let's just jump into it. Without further ado, my friends listening, I present to you Anti-Intellectualism in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. All right, Steve, as we get started, let's ask an icebreaker, but let's ask something a little bit more interesting. Here's a question. What is something that you're studying right now that's exciting you, or that's really interesting and intriguing?
Moral foundations theory.
What does that even mean?
Well, I don't understand it well yet, but I listened to Joshua Coates speak at FAIR, and he talked about the...
and he's over the B.H. Roberts Foundation, right? Which everybody should go check out, the B.H. Roberts Foundation, Mormoner.org. There's such incredible stuff.
Very, very cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Everybody who is interested in what we're doing will be interested in what they're doing.
Especially Mormoner. Mormoner is one of my favorite websites.
Mine too.
It's really fun.
Yeah, it's clever. It's super clever. Brilliant minds and very
Stephen
talented
Smoot,
people.
Who's been on our podcast.
Together.
He's one of the main people over there helping with it.
Yeah, just a fantastic resource.
Mm-hmm.
So he presented findings from a very, very large scale, substantial survey that the foundation did of current and former Latter-day Saints. And he analyzed the findings in light of moral foundations theory, which I had just heard tiny bits about, never had investigated much, but it's a theory by a social psychologist named Jonathan Haidt, I think. And he's written several books, some more about this than others, but I'm not in any position to sort of elaborate what it is here, but that's what I've been dabbling into, and I intend to get deeper into it.
Well, we're excited to hear what you learn as you keep studying. That's really cool. I want to give a shout out to what I'm learning right now.
Great.
And it's a shout out to the Church History Matters podcast with Scott Woodward, Casey Griffiths, both incredible. Yeah. I love them, professors and
good dudes.
Casey's a historian, isn't he? Is Scott? I think he's more just a professor right now. But
that's a big deal too.
Yeah, I mean it is a very big deal. But
he's
just
at
saying
BYU,
they're
Idaho.
smart. Yeah, smart
Scott's
dudes.
BYU, Idaho.
Yeah.
Casey is Provo.
And he works for Scripture Central, does a lot of cool stuff with them. But right now their podcast is all about succession and church presidencies. Yeah. And so since I started the podcast, it's really intrigued me, and I've started diving into some different books, and one of them I've started looking in a little bit to the Wilford Woodruff, some of his journals. Yeah. At the time of before he became president of the church, there were some people in the Quorum of the 12 who were like, should he be the next apostle? Right. There was some weird stuff with George Cannon, and
that's a good story.
A lot of crazy stuff in there, and so that's kind of what I've been studying.
I wrote an article about that.
Really?
Yeah.
I'll need to dive into it.
Yeah, it's a good story.
It really. Yeah. Some of it's shocking. I love learning about stuff that you just didn't know before. Like it's just interesting. There's a quote that I love, and it's in some country songs and in some rap songs, but it's when's the last time you did something for the first time? And I've kind of changed that for my brain of when's the last time you learned something for the first time.
Nice.
And so every day I'm trying to learn something new, and church presidency succession has been really intriguing to me lately. So much to learn.
That's a healthy perspective.
Yeah, I think so.
Lifelong learning, lifelong discipleship, growing. That's a growth mindset, to use the jargon, but it's also just a divine commission, right?
I think so.
And there's, to paraphrase Professor Nibley a little, he sometimes expressed frustration that we sometimes say in our prayers, help me learn something new, but we don't mean it. He's like, he complained of having students who didn't really want to be stretched. They didn't want to learn something new. And, I guess I've felt that way myself, but we ought to really mean it when we say, help me learn something new. And we ought to get out of assuming that we know stuff,
right?
That we know much. We don't know much at all.
Right.
There's a lot for us to learn, including about the very basics and fundamentals of the history and doctrine and the restoration.
Right. Something I love, I believe it was Hugh Nibley. Do not quote me on that. This is off the record. But I heard one time, I really think it was Hugh Nibley. He said something to the effect of, only hold me to the last 3 or 4 years of my research, because I'm going to learn more. Right. And what I've learned 3 or 4 years ago is probably going to be false. Yeah. And to me, feel that same thing. There are things that I know I've taught people in the last couple of years, and then I learned more, and I was like, oh, I probably shouldn't have taught that way.
Last time we were together, I was lamenting that I'm that way with the CES letter, right? Just in the last few months, weeks, I've learned a lot more about the CES letter, the nature of it, the text of it, the development of it that I didn't know before, and it completely changes things. So
right, and I think all of this leads us to what the author of the CES letter calls anti-intellectualism. It's a kind of a long section. Here's an idea though. Before let's dive into this one section. I think it gives a good narrative around this that may be interested. And so it's the September 6th.
Yeah.
So here's a quote in the CES letter. The September 6th were 6 members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who were excommunicated or disfellowshipped by the church in September and somewhere in October, I believe, in 1993, allegedly for publishing scholarly work.
Right in the middle of my undergraduate years at BYU.
Really? Did you know these professors?
I did not know any of them personally, but I knew of them and heard of
course.
Of many, and then eventually of all of these. Yeah. Sarah Patterson has an important new book called The September 6th about this whole history.
It's very interesting. Yeah. And some of these historians had some excellent stuff published before and even after some of this excommunication stuff.
I would go that far. I would say it's mixed, right?
Right.
I would
There
give
is
these
definitely
things
some mixed things,
yeah.
especially with some of them.
Yeah.
But let's dive into it. Boyd K. Packer said, so this is a few months before the September 6th. Elder Packer made the following comment regarding the three, quote, enemies of the church. He said, quote, "The dangers I speak of come from the gay lesbian movement, the feminist movement, both of which are relatively new, and the ever-present challenge from the so-called scholars or intellectuals." The first question I'd have before we dive into the narrative of the September 6th, as an academic, as an intellectualist, do you feel like the church itself, the leaders of the church, are condemn you or kind of hold you down to a more faithful layer of academia and not being able to dive into other stuff?
That's a terrific question. So the short answer to it is definitely not. But at the same time, it is the case that the church, especially in the last century, the leaders of the church have been quite careful and sometimes very candid about being learned is good if they hearken to the counsels of God, right? That if is huge. Mm-hmm. And you can do a lot of damage and be dangerous if you don't do things in the right order with the right motives. I was very much influenced to become a scholar by a verse in Doctrine and Covenants 93 that says, "Obtain a knowledge of history." And all this, and other things too, and all this for the benefit of Zion, for the good of Zion, right? So the original context of that was to the First Presidency and Bishop Whitney in May of 1833. But when I read it in the middle of my mission, it was revealed to me there then, right? The Lord impressed it on me by the Holy Spirit. He told me to study and become a scholar, but to do it for the right reasons and for the right ends. And whatever you do, right? If you're a stockbroker, or if you're an NFL player, or if you're a pianist, or if you're a scholar, it is relatively easy to do the right things for the wrong reasons, or to pursue ends that are not divine ends. They're selfish, right? This is the warning in Doctrine and Covenants 121. Their hearts are set so much on the things of this world, gratify their pride or their vain ambition, that they never learn that power, real, true, divine power only flows when we do it in the godly way. Right. So the prophets and apostles have to pretty constantly remind us, since we're fallen and easily influenced by my fallen nature. I'd like to win awards for writing books, right? I would love a Pulitzer Prize.
Of course.
And that's never going to happen, but I'd even like a little prize. And sometimes
like a Nobel Peace Prize.
Sure.
Something small.
Sure. Sometimes that's what motivates me, when what I should be motivated by is pure knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. What that revelation calls pure knowledge, and unfeigned love and gentleness, and no hypocrisy and no guile. So one of the jobs I take it of prophets and apostles is to make that reminder as needed. I feel tension in my own life between some of these things, right? The quotes you've made and bunches of others, right? I don't blame anybody who thinks, wow, I don't know how I should understand that, and who feels some tension. But let's notice this too, right? As we speak, the First Presidency is composed of an internationally renowned heart surgeon with academic credentials as high as you can imagine.
Right.
A former university president, Utah State Supreme Court justice, professor of law at the University of Chicago. You don't get higher credentials in the field than President Oaks has, or President Nelson. Well, President Eyring is not a bit behind, right? Harvard educated, Stanford business professor who could have done anything, right? His undergraduate work, I think, was in chemistry.
Right.
My goodness.
And I'd like to point out there's a good mix between the apostles.
Yeah.
We have those expert geniuses. We have Gary E. Stevenson, who is an incredible businessman who's made a lot of money with that. But then you have Ronald A. Rasband, who dropped out of college. So there's a very good mix of all of it in that first presidency.
And no slouch intellectually, right?
Oh, absolutely not. He worked for the Huntsman Chemical Corporation, did pretty impressive things, but it's just a good mix, and I think that's important to see.
As a body, right, and as individuals, these people are not anti-intellectual. For heaven's sake, they operate universities, right? And they expect these universities to meet the highest standards. As we speak, I've been in university conference meetings this week, and the message is crystal clear that the prophets and apostles expect first-class universities staffed with scholars who are among the best in the world at what they do, and who are hearken to the counsels of God. To be learned is good, very good, if they hearken to the counsels of God. So all they're doing is reminding us what the Revelations teach us, and to not get off track. An academic is inclined often, an occupational hazard is to think you know stuff.
Right.
There are studies on how much more inclined a person is to overclaim, right? To claim they know more than they know. And sometimes that's connected with, the
Lack
idea
of
that you know a lot.
Right.
Right. Your degree tells you know a lot. So therefore, anyway, I appreciate this point. I think it's a little bit of a red herring, though, to make an argument that the church is not true or something, because there have been statements made that could be construed, and maybe should be, as anti-intellectual from time to time.
Right.
If so, they are the outliers.
Of course.
They are rare and so against the mainstream of the church that they are not the story. They're by far the exception. The revelations to Joseph Smith, besides the one I quoted earlier, command learning, deep study.
Right.
Right. They are the reason for excellent academic credentials.
Right.
And excellent universities.
There's a quote here in the CES letter. It's by N. Eldon Tanner of the First Presidency, and it's a short quote, and it says, "When the prophet speaks, the debate is over," which is a very common thing I know we hear. But what I love is that there has been a major correction to some of that thinking. George Albert Smith, he once said, I am pleased to assure you that you are right in your attitude that the passage quoted does not express the true position of the church. Even to imply that members of the church are not to do their own thinking is grossly to misrepresent the true ideal of the church, which is that every individual must obtain for himself a testimony of the truth of the gospel, must, through the redemption of Jesus Christ, work out his own salvation, and is personally responsible to his Maker for his individual acts. The Lord does not attempt coercion in his desire and effort to give peace and salvation to his children. He gives the principles of life and true progress, but leaves every person free to choose or to reject his teachings.
Yeah.
This plan the authorities of the church try to follow.
Yeah. So that's nice to add balance. Right. The CES letter doesn't try to be balanced.
Right.
Its object is not to say, what have prophets ever said about this, including statements that could be seen as anti-intellectual and others that could be seen as encouraging academic study and excellence. And there are certainly plenty.
Right.
So rather than to do an inquiry to say, what has been the totality of our teachings about this, and therefore what should I understand about what the restoration is and entails, we have a relatively short passage that picks and chooses a few bits of evidence, does not contextualize them in a larger story, and uses them as a weapon against people's faith.
Right.
Well, you can do that, but that seems to me to be bad scholarship, among other things.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think we need to keep coming back to seek learning by study and by faith.
Yeah.
You need to have both.
Let's make that. I love that, Easton. I really appreciate that. That's the revealed recipe, right?
Mm-hmm.
I want to drive home that point that the CES letter is awful scholarship, right? One of my jobs is to be the editor-in-chief of BYU Studies. We publish scholarly articles. We put them through a peer review process. The CES letter would not withstand a peer review process. If you sent it to experts and said, is this the best scholarship in the field? They would say, no, that's awful. It makes several fallacious kinds of arguments. It's highly selective in its evidence. It is a biased rant, not a piece of balanced, what's the state of our knowledge, scholarship.
And I think
that's anti-intellectual.
That it is anti-intellectual. And I think a lot of people, I don't know if the author himself would be like, yeah, this is a beautiful piece of writing that should be, but so many of the readers look at it as this is a proselytizing tool to help people fall away from the church and whatnot.
But notice that here again, I don't want to be offensive or be mean. I'm not trying to be, but those readers are not the academics.
Absolutely.
You don't find people who are professors typically say, well, that CES letter, that is a brilliant piece of argumentation.
Right.
And that's true for ones who believe or don't believe or whatever. I mean, people who are used to making academic arguments that are informed by all the relevant evidence, they look at that and say that's just a partisan a hack, right? It's a one-sided piece. In other words, it's not interested in the truth. It's interested in its predetermined end, and it will use any means to arrive at that end, including obfuscating or hiding the truth. Now, the CES letter would say that's exactly what the church does. Well, the church, while the CES letter was being published, the church was publishing the Joseph Smith papers.
Absolutely. So I want your opinion on this. One thing that the author of the CES letter points out is we should not research unapproved, quote unquote, unapproved materials on the internet. He then puts a quote by Elder Cook, Elder Uchtdorf. I'll just read this one by Elder Anderson. I think it's a shorter one that I think brings it all together. Elder Anderson says, we might remind the sincere inquirer that internet information does not have a truth filter. Some information, no matter how convincing, is simply not true.
That's true.
Right. Do you feel like that is the church telling us we shouldn't research unapproved materials? And how should you determine what type of materials are approved, unapproved, or what you can or can't research?
So think about who the apostles, Elder Anderson, there are speaking to, right? They're speaking to the body of the church.
Right. It's a general conference.
Laity.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the laity don't know necessarily the tools of academic scholarship. They have the question, where do I go? Where do I look? And Elder Anderson and others have answered their question by saying, here are some principles that will help you, right? Just to Google without any sort of discrimination is not a way to get to the truth. So they're teaching true principles and sound practices in the information age. But that needs to be, notice those are selective again, right? If you took the totality of all that they've taught, their overwhelming emphasis is on seek learning by study and also by faith. Do it wisely, do it well. In 2016, Elder Ballard gave a fantastic talk, which I doubt you'll find there. And it was, he took me and others to task and said, don't ever tell your students again, don't ask that question. Or he said, or
just pray about it.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
That is not good enough. And so learn. Know this stuff, he said, like the back of your hand.
Mm-hmm.
Learns. I mean, that's not anti-intellectual.
Right.
And that's the gist of what comes from the prophets and apostles.
Right. Steve, there's a quote also here in this. from President Oaks, Elder Oaks at the time. And Jeremy says, Elder Dallin H. Oaks made the following disturbing comment in the PBS documentary, The Mormons.
He has to tell me it's disturbing,
right?
Because I'm not mature enough to decide for myself if it's disturbing or not.
Right. And Steve, we're going to dive into the entirety of this quote after I read the sentence the authors put. It is wrong to criticize the leaders of the church, even if the criticism is true. Dun, dun, dun. That is a big quote. Let's dive into what Dallin actually said. Dallin H. Oaks. He says, I call him Dallin like he's my friend.
You're a braver man than I am.
Dallin H. Oaks, he first talks a little bit about church history, but then he says, I also said something that has excited people, that it's wrong to criticize leaders of the church, even if the criticism is true, because it diminishes their effectiveness as a servant of the Lord. One can work to correct them by some other means, but don't go about saying that they misbehaved when they were a youngster or whatever. Well, of course, that sounds like religious censorship also. But not everything that's true is useful. I am a lawyer and I hear something from a client. It's true, but I'll be disciplined professionally if I share it because it's part of the attorney-client privilege. There's a husband-wife privilege, there's a priest-penitent privilege, and so on. That's an illustration of the fact that not everything that's true is useful to be shared. So much more to it.
Yeah. And notice that Runnels and John DeLynn and others, as well as myself, they claim that privilege, right? Mormon Leaks, they were happy to publish other people's, confidential info, but they didn't give us any of their own. It's a double standard. So I affirm that privilege. And that's a sound principle that President Oaks articulated there.
Right. Steve, I think this might be our final point. And it's about the Strengthening the Church Members Committee. Have you heard of this committee?
I have heard of it.
So I'll read the quote that is found here in CES Letter, and then let's discuss it a little bit. The spying and monitoring arm of the church. It is secretive, and most members have been unaware of its existence since its creation in 1985, after President Ezra Taft Benson became the prophet. Elder Jeffrey R. Holland admitted it still exists in March 2012. The historical evidence in the September 6 points to the Strengthening the Church Members Committee's primary mission being to hunt and expose intellectuals and or disaffected members who are influencing other members to think and question, despite Elder Holland's claim that its committee primarily to fight against polygamy. That's just kind of a thing thrown at the end. I think you'd have to read the whole quote to understand that part. But
so who do you think knows better what that committee is, Elder Holland or the folks who've got a few pieces of the puzzle?
I think maybe Elder Holland.
I bet Elder
I'd give
Holland
it to Elder
knows
Holland.
better. I bet he knows better the whole story.
Right.
And what the little bit I know of the Strengthening the Members Committee, which comes to me filtered through other stuff, is disturbing. So what I do is I think slowly about that. And I think maybe it's possible that I am inclined, like every other human being, to default to the heuristic, the mental shortcut, that what I see is all there is. And if I assumed that what I see about the Strengthening the Members Committee is all there is, then I could be disturbed. But what if I slowed down and said, I bet I don't know all there is to know about the Strengthening the Members Committee. So what if I didn't pretend to know more? What if I just held what I know in my hands and add to it, right? And what if I put that knowledge in the totality of all my knowledge? Then how does it look? And then it looks like a few disturbing or potentially disturbing pieces of information amidst 10,000 affirmations of the restored gospel and the living prophets. And that makes me able to say, I don't know a thing about the Strengthening of the Members Committee, and I'm not likely to learn anything much about it. I'm just going to hang on to that and keep my ears open, my eyes open. In other words, we just think slow.
Right.
We think slowly about it, and we don't hyperventilate when we come across something disturbing. We process it deeply. We don't put our head in the sand. We don't pretend it doesn't exist, But we also don't pretend that all the other stuff we knew before doesn't exist either, right? So that's what we do.
I think that's powerful. Steve, as we conclude, what would your advice be to somebody who's wanting to dive into the intellectual side of the church, but there's also a concern of this anti-intellectualism? As an academic yourself, what would your advice be to them?
Well, so dive in, right? The apostles have taught us to not take counsel, from our fears. Dive in, but do it with an honest heart. I mean, it's an anti-intellectual practice to just listen to one side of something.
Right.
So don't do that. Listen to everything and everyone. Now, I'm not prescribing that for everybody, right? I read CES Letter backwards and forwards, right? I read Eber Howe's Mormonism Unveiled and Alex Campbell's Delusions, I can't keep up with all the anti-Mormon stuff in the information age, but I've read it from the 19th century, right? So, and there's really not a whole lot new under the sun.
Yeah, not really.
So I'm a person who, you couldn't keep me from reading that stuff. I have to know, and I want to know, and I want to know what all the Joseph Smith papers say. I need to know. And you could hide them under a rock, and I'm going to go find that rock and lift it up and read them. So for people like me, join me, join in. There's nothing here to be afraid of. Expect to spend a good deal of your life coping with ambiguities and tensions between facts and interpretations, right? If you're up for that, then you're up for an academic life.
Right.
If you're not, if you don't deal well with tensions between differing schools of thought or different interpretations of the same facts, then do something else useful to mankind. But you're not equipped personality-wise for an academic life.
Right.
So there's nothing to be afraid of. If it's for you, if that's who you are in your personality, then by all means, contribute to the advancement of knowledge. Do it humbly, and do it knowing that to be learned is good if you hearken to the counsels of God.
Right. Well, Steve, I think the invitation today is just dive in. Start learning. If that's what you feel like you need, dive in. Learn as much as you can. Read every page of the Joseph Smith papers that you can find, and be hungry for more knowledge.
Right.
Anything else you'd add?
Start with and end with, and in the middle, read the scriptures. Read the scriptures. There will be your grounding.
Right.
The Book of Mormon, chief among them. So that's, if you spend your life in the Journal of Discourses, you may know a lot of cool stuff, but you will not get closer to God by abiding the precepts in the Journal of Discourses. But there's nothing that will get you closer to God than abiding by the precepts in the Book of Mormon.
Right.
So if you want to know, then get close to God. God is the source of all knowledge. So it's impossible, in my judgment, to long for intelligence, light, knowledge, and to do it without seeking and receiving the Holy Ghost.
Right.
I don't know how that's even possible. The knowledge you can gain that way is not salvific knowledge. It doesn't endure. So I want the knowledge that endures. I want that promise that whatever principle of intelligence we attain to here, we will take it with us there. That's the kind of knowledge I'm after. And so that's what I would emphasize.
Amen. Well, Steve, thank you for joining us today. And I want to thank all of our listeners and our viewers today for joining us. As always, we invite you to share this with your friends, families, any truth seekers in your life, and just dive into as much of the facts as you possibly can. Thank you so much, and we'll talk to you next time.